Committee Room 30. Sound.
Okay, so if we're content then we're going to proceed with the agenda. So we've just received apologies for Podrick. Please pass on our best regards to him.
Okay.
There's certainly lots going around the Assembly chamber. So in terms of chairperson's business, members, I along with the clerk were in Washington last week as part of the sort of calendar of events in relation to promoting Northern Ireland amongst our American the policy and decision makers over there. So it was a really positive week. I said at one point that I felt that I was almost stalking our First and Deputy First Minister, because everywhere they were I turned up, but they had a terrific week, and the positivity was really wonderful, and I hope that we'll see some really good announcements off the back of their engagement and our engagement as a committee in the near future. So members, in terms of draft minutes, you'll find those at pages 6 to 11 of your meeting pack, and if members are content that they're a true and accurate reflection of the meeting, or they're happy for me to go ahead and sign them. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in terms of matters arising, so on page 13 there's a press release and statement from the February 2024 meeting of the Interparliamentary Forum. As you'll recall, I was over there along with Matthew O'Toole as chair of the Finance Committee, and that's just for noting. I would draw your attention to page 16 of the clerk's brief, on the mother and baby homes and the historical supply of bodies for anatomical study. Any of you who were on the previous committee will know that this has been a long-running issue. So the individual who wrote to the committee has asked for us to go back to Queen's, and they don't feel that they have conducted the investigation into the issue quickly enough or thoroughly enough, and have asked for our support in terms of writing to expedite that piece of work. Are people content?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, thank you. And I think that we will hopefully hear from this individual when we get to that point in terms of our forward work programme as well. So we're going to move on, members, to the Victims and Survivors Service, and we're going to take oral evidence. So the clerk's brief is on page 21, the briefing from the Victims and Survivors Service is on page 23, and then on page 32 there's a corporate overview and guide. So our the two members from the Victims and Survivors Service are Oliver Wilkinson, who's the chair, and Andrew Walker, who is the chief executive. So I'm going to ask them to take their seat, and you're very welcome, gentlemen. I have just given your names and titles, but if you want to give us a briefing and maybe just give us a wee bit of an overview of your own roles within the organisation to start, that'd be great. Thank you.
Will we?
Yes, please.
Begin our session.
Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, Chair, Committee, and thank you for the invitation to brief you today on the work of the Victim and Survivor Service. My name is Oliver Wilkinson. I'm the chair of the board, and with me is Andrew Walker, who is our chief executive. We last briefed this board back in September 21 and are now conscious that many of the members have changed. And so therefore both my opening remarks and the briefing paper that we have already provided aims to provide an introduction for new members to the work that we do. This is especially important given the expanded remit of the Victim and Survivor Service now that we're supporting survivors of historical institutional abuse, mother and baby institutions, Magdalene laundries and workhouses, in addition to the original role of supporting victims and survivors of our conflict. The briefing paper provided within your pack outlines the approach we take to supporting individuals across these three areas and through a number of programmes, with a common theme of being victim-centred, needs-based and community-led. And before taking questions, I would like the opportunity to provide you with a brief summary of the current service delivery model we have, how we're supporting people in the community, and also highlight some of the strategic issues and updates that we think you might be interested in. The briefing paper provided outlines our approach to service delivery, in particular the stepped care model, which is demonstrated in it, shows how we support individuals in all of the three areas that I mentioned to you. We deliver this support primarily in partnership with 48 community and voluntary sector organisations, enabling individuals to access the support that they need close to where they live. Health and wellbeing caseworkers and advocacy support workers working with these 48 partner organisations help individuals and survivors to identify what it is they need and connect them with the support and the services they require. However, where needs are more complex, our case managers arrange for bespoke services, which could include the provision of disability aids, education and training, and other higher level psychological supports. Over the period from 2017 to 22, supported by the Peace 4 programme, over 11,500 individuals were engaged in this way with health and wellbeing support, and over 14,000 with advocacy support related to the issue of legacy. The measurement of what we do has been a priority throughout, ensuring that we capture and evidence any change that we're making. We know, for example, that within our Troubles conflict-related work, 60% of those we engage with in talking therapies report improvement. And likewise, for complementary therapies, 80% of those we work with report improvement. We're very keen to examine how these outcomes across the other areas of our work, which we have more recently taken on, work out given the different profiles and other external factors. Now, the services that we and our community and voluntary sector partners provide are what are described as step 1 to 3 interventions, according to the step care model of mental health provision. I mention this because one hugely significant development since the last time we were here has been the delivery of a regional trauma network. This network joins together the work of the community and voluntary sector, providing that step 1 to 3 level of care, with the statutory health sector providing care at steps 4 and 5. And what that means is higher intensity psychological or psychiatric support. The Regional Trauma Network provides for protected and prioritised pathways for victims and survivors, and affords a unique opportunity for new ways of working together to deliver what we consider to be world-leading trauma care. We look forward to discussing this further with you if you have questions today, but in continuing that conversation at future committee meetings. There are, of course, a whole range of achievements that we would like to outline and current challenges to highlight. The past few years have been very busy for us, and more importantly, extremely challenging for many of those that we support. We're conscious that alongside our work, there are the issues of cost of living pressures, the changing landscape in respect to legacy, the important milestones and anniversaries, and the many varied and unique challenges which are individual to each and every individual victim and survivor we seek to support. We have outlined these in the briefing paper, and I would touch on a few just now. Within the Troubles conflict work, we continue to engage with others to support applicants to the Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme. We, along with our community-based partners, continue to work with the Victims Payment Board and others to try to improve the experience of applicants at all stages of that process. Secondly, we recognise the need for a new victim strategy, and we welcome the collaborative co-design approach which the Department has taken alongside us, the Commission and other community-based partners. A new strategy will provide the framework for the future within which our funding programmes can be renewed, refreshed to align with changing user needs. In supporting survivors of historical institutional abuse, we continue to learn from the services we provide and the outcomes we measure. We are closely engaged with departmental colleagues in their efforts to promote services and to highlight the remaining opportunities to make redress applications in the final year of the redress scheme. And finally, as the Department continues to progress key structures and legislation relating to survivors of the mother and baby institutions, Magdalen laundries and workhouses, we work alongside specialist community and voluntary sector partners to carefully align the support and the services to the important processes associated with the independent panel and future inquiry. Finally, the board and the senior management of the Victim and Survivor Service look forward to working with you as a committee and with colleagues across the sector, the commissioners, the departments in the coming years, and in doing so, our focus will remain very firmly on how we can improve the health and the well-being of victims and survivors. Thank you. We are happy to take and welcome any questions you might have.
Andrew, are you just going to come? Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you for getting us papers well in advance. We always appreciate that as a committee to read through those. So I'll have a few questions, then I'll open up to others. So you touched upon it a bit there around the regional trauma network. And so what role do you have in terms of managing that? I'm conscious that there's, in the past when they were trying to get that up and running, they were talking about potential issues with human resource capability, potential gaps. There were talks about opening that up to ex-armed forces. So I'm just wondering, is that form part of it? So that's really the regional trauma network in terms of capacity. But also then, in terms of the 48 community voluntary sector partner organisations, sounds like a lot of mouths to feed, and I'm sure they all do an amazing amount of work. So I'm just wondering in what way you would, with the crisis in funding, in what way would you try to facilitate closer collaboration between them? And also then, how do you ensure that quality of service across all of them in terms of keeping up with international best practice? I know you talked about the step care model there, but just making sure that there's that quality of output when you've got so many, such a large network to manage. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll maybe just start on the regional trauma network point.
Yes.
So I suppose the regional trauma network has been a really huge success over the last year, 18 months since the decision was taken to stand that back up and to co-design along with community and voluntary sector and the health and social care trusts and ourselves and the Commission and the Department for Health to set up the regional trauma network and get it to the point where it is actually operational. Yep. There is a team centrally within the Department of Health that is involved in the management of that. There's also input from the Victim Survivor Service, and most importantly, there's a partnership board now in place. So the partnership board consists of the Executive Office, chaired jointly by the Executive Office and the Department of Health, but crucially it includes leaders from some of the C&V organisations, from ourselves, and from the Health and Social Care Trust. So there is that oversight now of the whole process, which has been really important to driving it forward and to delivering it in this operational phase. It is, of course, the RTN is open to all victims and survivors. We apply the Victims Order 2006, and that is what applies to the all aspects of the RTN. And I suppose we need to think of the regional trauma network now as the widest possible sense. So you mentioned the 48 community and voluntary organisations. All those organisations form part of the regional trauma network. And similarly, all the health and social care trusts and the regional trauma teams within those trusts form part of the network. And I suppose the step that we've taken over the last period of time is to join those two things together and make it that there are those pathways for victims and survivors to come through in both directions. There's no wrong door. It's about the right care at the right time in the right place. And that may mean that for some victims and survivors, the support they need is not available within the community and voluntary sector, but they can access that support at steps 4 and 5 of our model within the statutory side, and that can be guided through that process and guided into that care that they need. Similarly, there will be those who are engaged with their trusts for psychological interventions, and it can be very useful to have wraparound support within the community and voluntary sector alongside that. You can, of course, be at various points of that step care model at the same time, and that's that holistic model, which is very important. I think the most important thing with the regional trauma network is that we're building those relationships between sectors now, and that's a real focus over the first period of time has been to build those relationships, and now individuals can be supported in both places at the same time.
Okay, so I asked about the quality assurance and international best practice, and I'm just wondering how that features.
There's a range of ways, particularly within the Victim Survivor Service. We've undertaken recently a renewal of our Victims' Choice Quality Mark, so that comes in and looks at all of our systems and how we cascade that down amongst the 48 organisations. And I know your question was asking about all of those organisations. Of course, all the different organisations do different things. It ranges from a very small, what we call our small grant organisations, doing social support, supporting social support for individual victim survivors coming together as a group, and that can be quite small amounts of money and voluntary based operations, right through to the largest organisations, and several of our larger organisations would be BACP certified and members accreditation of BACP. So there's a range of ways that we can ensure that the standards which the Commission have set for all of the services are met by all of the organisations that are part of it. Of course, the whole cascade of governance and arrangements similar to that within the statutory side of the RTN as well.
Okay. Just one last one for me then, and that's around the issue of those milestones and anniversaries. So somebody may come into the service and get 6 sessions or a certain amount of support. How do they come back in? Is there an option for them to come back in maybe 2 years, 10 years down the line?
There is many individuals stay with organisations for longer periods of time, and again at those levels of 1, 2 and 3 in the step care model, social support can be really an ongoing process. But similarly, of course, if there are milestones, if there are things that trigger an individual or relive a traumatic event, and anniversaries can be a good example of that. The organisations are always there to step in and support individuals many times and multiple times. It's the right care in the right place, as we said, so that there's many opportunities to engage with individuals at the right time.
Okay, I'll open up to members. If a couple more people will open up. Go ahead, Connie.
Thank you both for coming in to brief us today. I really appreciate it. I have 2 questions, if there's time. The first one is the ICRIR recently launched a consultation on the operational design of the organisation. Given there was a lot of opposition to the Legacy Act, which brought this into being from a lot of victims groups and survivors groups, are you going to respond to that consultation? What engagement have you had with them, and how do you see your relationship with that board, considering the opposition there is within the victims community to them? And maybe after that, if they have time, I have another question, if that's okay.
I think you're right. There is clearly been significant opposition to the Act and the bill, both within political parties and also across many of the community and voluntary organisations that we support. I think in terms of supporting individuals, the role of advocacy within our model is to be led by the needs and the wishes of individual victims and survivors. So our approach to date, and as we intend to continue, will be that we should follow the needs and the wishes of those individual victims and survivors. So some may well and will want to engage with ICRIR, and we have to support them to do that. Others will not want to engage, and it's equally important that we have other projects and activity and advocacy type support that can help those individuals to engage in whatever way they want with whatever process they want. So there will be recording lived experience type projects, there will be other ways to access information from public records, and I think those 2 things need to happen alongside one another. In terms of the relationship with the ICRIR, we have met as a board and as a senior management team with Sir Declan Morgan, and we've got an understanding of what his approach is, and we do have some interaction and some connections with his team as they're starting to set up those processes.
Yeah, I think it's we're working on the assumption that while there is a great deal of unhappiness about what is proposed, there will be a number, however, whatever that number is, I don't know, but a significant number of people who will want to access that particular service or organisation, and we have to be there to provide support to them. And the way that we are focused on at the moment is to try and ensure that in our conversations so far with Sir Declan, that there is an understanding that there should be a pathway which is as least traumatic as possible, should not cause harm to the individual who decides that this is the direction that they want to go in, regardless of the outcome. So we have started that conversation. We may be involved in further conversations with them, but it will be specifically to that end. We don't, because of the nature of who we are, have a particular position, a policy position, on whether the Legacy Act is good, bad or indifferent.
Yeah, go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Next question is about the Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme. The Secretary of State is under statutory duty to review that scheme. As a service, what would you like to see come out of that review?
I think the most important thing within that review is to consider the deadline for the end of the backdating period. So as it stands, there is a deadline within the scheme of 31st of August 2024, so this year, beyond which any subsequent applications won't qualify for the backdated element of the scheme, which can be up to 10 years backdating at this point. So that immediately creates a number of problems, both in terms of equity of those who have been through, before the deadline and those who come after, but also, our key role has been to support applicants via the community and voluntary organisations that we've supported with welfare advisors to help, with actual applications with specific support. There are waiting lists in many of those organisations, and this is going to put organisations in a very difficult position where they have a waiting list, more and more people coming with applications and asking for support. There's very recently, in the last number of weeks, been a leaflet drop to every home in Northern Ireland. So we're expecting more applications to come forward and more requests for support with applications. And I think there will be a real sense that we've got to make that deadline. So there'll be undue pressure on welfare advisors to get through those applications. I don't think that's in the interest, certainly, of the staff that are trying to help. It's not really the quality of the applications. It's not in the interest really of the Victims Payment Board to have a whole range of probably poorly prepared applications just put in very quickly to meet the deadline. It'd be far better if that could be staggered over the remaining period of the scheme. So that's something that's been put forward directly to the Secretary of State and to the NIO and as part of the review, both by the Commissioner, and you're going to hear from the Commissioner a little bit later. That point of view was put across by the Commissioner, also by the victim survivor groups who are helping with applications. They've said that's the single most important thing that could happen to avoid that sort of cliff edge and that really high pressure deadline in the remainder of this year.
Thank you. Thank you. Sinead and then Harry.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation and update. Obviously, the Victim Survivor Service, you're going through a new strategy at the minute, and I suppose with the additional services and the additional people that you support, it's a very different service than originally was envisaged, and it's more complex, and those that go through the programs are very, very different in nature. Conflict trauma is very, very different than those in the mother and baby units or the workhouses, and that the complexity of it, what I'm trying to say, the complexity of it, how are you going to meet the different and various needs within this new strategy, and based on the fact that the people that you're serving, that are getting the services, are so diverse?
I think there's two things there. There's the new strategy, which is the new strategy coming forward for the victims, survivors of the Troubles and conflict. So that is the the next version of the original 2009 strategy, and that will be focused on troubles conflict. So that gives a real clear guidance on how we design the next programmes over the next 5-10 year period. That is out to consultation at the minute, and we've very clear ideas on what has gone into it. We've been involved in the co-design of that strategy, and we're looking forward to having a strategy that we can use to build the next programmes. Sort of separately to that is the second part of your question, in terms of we've now got effectively 3 strands of our service. We've got our troubles conflict, historical institutional abuse, mother and baby institutions, Magdalen laundries and workhouses. It's a similar model, and I suppose pointing back to the briefing paper, the step care model, the community-led, victim-centred and trauma-informed model is the same for each of those areas. But some of the services are slightly different, so there'll be a focus on what is important to the victims and survivors coming forward in each of those areas. So in historical institutional abuse, we're including things like help with the redress process, and that's one of the differences between that and perhaps the troubles conflict side. Mother baby institutions, Magdalen laundries, workhouses, a little bit earlier in the journey, so it is all about information retrieval. It's about preparing for testimony with the independent panel and the statutory inquiry to come, and the wraparound support and services around that, and again with an idea of a redress scheme to come as well. So the same model, obviously quite large and diverse within troubles conflict, with 48 organisations as mentioned earlier, much smaller number of organisations across the other 2 areas, quite similar services but tailored to the individual needs of victims and survivors, and that's been designed through co-design with victims and survivors and with their representatives.
And in relation to the memorial to victims and survivors of Historical Institute of Abuse, have you been given any update on that?
So obviously there was the Hart inquiry recommendation for a physical memorial in the grounds of this place, and I understand from the Executive Office that is proceeding. There's obviously a range of different views on what the appropriate memorial would be. There are some who support that idea of physical memorial. There's others that point to other ideas, other valid suggestions around exhibitions or bursaries or other ideas. I suppose as the service, as VSS, our role has been to support individuals who want to engage and offer those views. So where there has been consultation events or meetings to discuss the different ideas, it's ensuring that there is that emotional support in the room from VSS to help people put those views forward. As for the actual decisions, that's something that's going to rest with the Executive Office.
Okay, thank you.
One final thing I would like to add is that while the services are in many ways distinct within the organisation to the 3 separate groups, there is considerable overlap in what it is that we do, and the most interesting overlap over the next number of years, I think, will be seeing those individuals who perhaps come from mother and baby units or historical institutional abuse, who are also in their life experience victims of our conflict. So you can't assume that they are discrete areas. I think there will be even more overlap than we originally imagined.
I suppose into that, the intergenerational trauma that brings up as well. So a new cohort could be presenting for services as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Brian, Harry and then Brian.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Okay. In recent years, you've taken on additional remit in terms of historical abuse and Magdalene laundry abuse. How do you feel the VSS has managed the additional workload?
So I suppose with each of those new remits came additional responsibilities and additional resource requirements, and we were supported by the Executive Office to build up those areas. I think it needs to be a constant process of reflecting on what is needed in each of those areas as they move through those journeys. Obviously, historical institutional abuse, since VSS has been involved, has moved through a process of, there was a redress scheme, there was an apology, we've got the support and services, it's moving through that journey. Mother and baby, Magdalen laundries workhouse at a different place, but again, we're planning for scaling up support alongside some of the important things that are going to happen over the next number of years. More generally, I suppose what number one to recognise is we've always had good support from the Executive Office and from the Executive and the Assembly more widely in terms of support for the work that we do, and that's important to note. Secondly, we have on the back of the third extra element of our remit, we have completed a staffing review over the last couple of years and reformed how the organisation looks really in terms of the structures, and we're moving through the final part of that process now, and starting to build the capacity within VSS centrally. There's also, of course, the matter of the resources more widely for the community and voluntary sector, because that's how we deliver services, particularly in troubles conflict, whereas as to the first question, there are 48 organisations. There's a lot of competing priorities for funding. I think the next real opportunity to make any significant change there will be when we design a new 3-year victim support programme. That needs to fall out of the strategy. So again, we're back to the importance of getting the strategy that's right and getting it in place, and that'll help us to get the right structure.
All follow.
Go ahead.
Would you say the organisation has benefited from the wider remit?
Yes, I think there's learning, as Oliver mentioned. There's an overlap certainly in client base. There's also an opportunity for us to learn from each of those different areas and to feed that back into our service more generally. Obviously, also the growth of VSS as an organisation gives us that opportunity to devote a little bit more resource to learning and sharing what we've learned with others, both locally and nationally and internationally, and to complete the research that'll help us to design new and better programmes going forward. So, yeah, there's definitely been a benefit there.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Ryan,
Chair, I think, Chair, the one other thing in this, and we were conscious of this as a board, is that for these other services to be established independently would have required additional expense to the public purse, whereas we had a structure already there, and with the assurance that we would have the resources we need to separately support the different strands of the work, we felt that we could, with the existing senior management structure, the existing board, we could pretty much provide the services that were there. And yes, we think it has been a benefit to the organisation.
Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Okay. Thank you for your answers so far and for the important and sensitive work that you're doing in association with those 48 partner organisations. And over the years, I've had experience of engaging with quite a number of families who were bereaved during the Troubles. And while some would have a public profile to some extent, I find the majority bear their suffering very privately, and it cuts very deep, and it will last their lifetime. And it is important that those support services are there for them and for their families, and recognising there is also an intergenerational impact of people even who were not alive at the time when the incident occurred, but the family memory of that and the stories of that are carried forward. And my concern, I don't want to put you in an awkward spot, but I do want to raise the issue of how, as a society, this is an issue that we all have a responsibility for. And I do have a concern when events are held or comments are made by public representatives which would be perceived as glorifying or elevating the perpetrators of terrorism, and the responsibility on us to represent peaceful and democratic means of changing society and of promoting a healthy society. Is that something which you receive feedback from some of those groups or families that you deal with, if you're able to comment on that? And I have one other question briefly.
I would try to answer it in this way. We try to encourage all our staff, all our board members, and all our partner organisations in the conversations they have together to be very conscious of who it is that they're speaking to, and to try and find language that encourages dialogue rather than separates and causes conflict between people. We are encouraged by the fact that increasingly our organisations have become more focused on their own, perhaps little local service, but on working with others, and in the course of working with others, maybe from what they perceive to be the other community, they are learning more about how to better help and support people, and for themselves learning to realise that language is really important. We need to be very careful what we say and do, and we think that is slowly but surely happening, and to the extent that we're able to do that, we're trying to encourage that. But there are much, much bigger issues on this right across our community that I think we all as individuals need to reflect on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. One other question, just on a practical matter. In terms of the Troubles Permanent Disablement Pension Scheme, I've assisted a number of people applying for that, not least verifying documents. And I appreciate there has to be criteria for the scheme, but a number of people have been disappointed not to be eligible or find that they weren't eligible. Primarily, it seems because they weren't personally present at the time of the incident, even though if it impacted on a close family member, it has resulted in lifelong trauma for them, and it was a life-changing situation for them. But is it the correct understanding that it has to be a physical disability, first of all, and the person has to have been present when it occurred, and it's more difficult even if it's not a physical disability, if it's a mental impact, that can be more difficult to be eligible.
Certainly, the permanent disability and presence at the incident or in the immediate aftermath are some of the key criteria within the scheme. So those are regulations laid down that can't be changed, certainly by us nor by the Victims Payment Board who manage the scheme. But you do point to an issue there particularly for the bereaved, who are far less likely to have been present in many cases at the incident. This makes that particular scheme much more difficult to access for the bereaved. And I suppose that is one of the things that is driving the need for some sort of separate scheme for the bereaved. Going back a little bit, before the TPDPS came along, VSS did have and does still have a much more modest annual payment for victims and survivors, which covers bereaved, injured and carers. At the point at which the TPDPS, which is a much more generous scheme, came along to more comprehensively deal with the needs of the injured, we reopened. We had previously had closed those schemes due to budget pressures in 2017. We have reopened the bereaved scheme to ensure that those who missed it first time around can apply for that scheme. It is still two very different schemes at very different ends of the scale in terms of the payment values. So there is still a need for something different for the bereaved that cannot meet the criteria for that scheme. I know that there has been an advice paper provided by the Commission for Victims and Survivors just in January of this year, so that is back with the department now to consider the options for some sort of way to address that disparity and that inequity really between the injured and the bereaved on that matter. But yeah, no, you're correct. It is more difficult. There's no doubt about that. In terms of the physical and psychological injury, yes, really it's the access to and the presence of documentation that can evidence the injury, which is probably the factor that causes the differential in time. There are arrangements in place that for psychologically injured where there is no diagnosis or no support and evidence available from medical records, that there are ways to assess those conditions and to make a diagnosis now. That does take a little bit longer. So that is, of course, one of the frustrations of the scheme is just the length of time. We're not administering the scheme, but we are working with the Victims Payment Board and with those community and voluntary organisations to try and find improvements and ways to speed up certain parts of that applicant journey.
It's a really interesting point that you've raised, and what I would ask that the committee would consider is that in relation to the Troubles Permanent Disablement Pension Scheme, while I have no criticism of it, if you apply a gender lens to it, it is primarily men who were disabled. It was primarily women who were bereaved. So anything that would help with the paper that the Commission have submitted in relation to a scheme for women, for the bereaved rather, might go some way to addressing a very obvious problem, but one that I'm not sure was seen at the time. So your active interest in that would be appreciated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Claire, Emma, and then Carol, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I think the work that you do is critically important, particularly in a post-conflict society in Northern Ireland. And I recognise that in 2024, we're probably seeing that conflict generation, if we can call it that, is now getting to a point in their lives where the traumas of the past, which may not have been apparent in the midst of family life, in the midst of employment, is now going to come to the fore within their retirement. I suppose just mindful of your strategy moving forward and how you address that, is that something that you will be considering as part of that work moving forward? Because I think a lot of what's obvious about your work, if I can put it that way, and I know that's not the right way to describe it, there's going to be an awful lot more that comes through in relation to that. I suppose where I have a real interest in trauma, and I think government right across the board has to take a more trauma-informed approach, even down to policies that aren't necessarily directly related to trauma and mental health. But for example, Minister in the Department of Justice, and we're seeing paramilitary ads on the TV. Who's that going to serve? In my opinion, all it did was re-traumatise the victims of the travel, and it certainly wouldn't have curbed the issue that they were trying to do. I understand why they did it, but I think we have to be more mindful around what we do so that we as a government are not actually re-traumatising people again. And I suppose one of the biggest issues, and it's, Chair, if you'll indulge me, is that how do you see the impact of our desperate public services impacting on all of these issues? I have an issue now where police officers cannot access in-house mental health services through PTSD, so work-related stresses, and can't access the health services in the community either, because those services already exist within their jobs. So they're not getting any help. They're coming to the end of their 6 months sickness absence, and then they're going down to half pay, which then re-traumatises them. So, and I say that very specifically in relation to you, because an awful lot of those police officers were former RUC, and it's not just police, it's frontline services. So I suppose ultimately what I'm asking you is where do you see the problems within the current system to actually move forward and address the issues? Like, ultimately, as a post-conflict society, we do need to do way much more than what we're doing in terms of addressing that. And other people have mentioned intergenerational trauma. That is absolutely the case. We are not addressing this in an upstream way to actually tackle the problem. We're just passing it down the line. So,
I think in terms of your first point there about the strategy, there's certainly key things that we think need to be in the strategy, and they are in the draft, and perhaps need fleshed out a little bit in the final version. So we do have some topics in there around the bereaved, which we've mentioned, around social isolation, around the ageing client population. We see that in the data from the types of services that we are providing that are the most needed at this point in time. It is a group of survivors that are getting older, and also intergenerational trauma as well. So those are some of the key things that I think having those clearly identified within the strategy. Everything leads from that, so our projects and our programmes can then lead to how do we address those through the community organisations as well. In terms of the trauma-informed approach, I mentioned the Victim's Choice quality mark that we have for our own services. We're also currently working through a trauma-informed quality mark with the Safeguarding Board in Northern Ireland, with a view to, I think after we complete that, we'd like to start to think about how can that be cascaded down amongst organisations and actually across departments as well. So the idea
think
of
legislation would be useful? I explored this a little bit a number of years ago, and it was almost like a piece of legislation that compelled government departments and statutory agencies to put a screening exercise on all of their policies, similar as we would do with the quality legislation. Now, I didn't develop it enough, and I think as an independent I would be quite limited in doing that, but certainly it'd be something the Executive Office might want to consider. And, but I just wondered, do you think we're at a point where we need to legislate for it because everything else we've tried is just not really doing what it's intended to do?
I think that the strategy, if there's a focus within the strategy on the need to broaden this out across departments, that will be certainly the first step. The options of how you do that then, I guess, will be back down to the departments as to whether that needs the legislation or whether that's something permanent secretaries and departments can come together and come to an agreement on.
Yeah, I think based on our experience, ideally what I would like to see is that any person who engages with an individual who is a victim or survivor of our conflict, that person who engages should be trauma aware. And now, taking that a step further, whether it is housing, education, whatever, right across government, it would be wonderful to think that there was a commitment, a vision within our society that that we would be a trauma-informed society given what people have experienced over the years of conflict. And in that sense, whether it is by legislation or whether it is by good practice, it would be great to see something like that in place.
Okay, Emma, please.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to you both for your presentation. I was on the committee the last time around, and I know one of the concerns that we had was the proportion of people. I know that the figures that you've referred to both today and in the presentation are quite impressive in terms of those reached, but the proportion of those who aren't reached, and I know you've made reference there to a leaflet drop, but the cohort of those that haven't been able to access any support, have you any idea around what sort of figures we're talking about there, or experience in trying to access those people?
We know the numbers of people that we support, and we know that is a very small proportion of the number of people who were impacted by I think we're talking primarily troubles conflict, but you could take that question wider as well. I suppose we need to remember there are many people who don't need and don't want that support. It's a matter of making sure that everyone is aware that it is there. And I think we do that through a range of different ways. We talked about the leaflet drop earlier. That's something that's happening across every household in Northern Ireland, specifically in relation to the TPDPS scheme. But it is raising that awareness of the fact that there are groups there that can help. Everyone who goes through that process is signposted to groups for wider health and wellbeing support. And it's just about raising that awareness that there are organisations there that can support across a whole range of needs. So yeah, there's certainly more that we can do to reach out to more people, and I think attaching that to some of these other initiatives that are happening is one way to reach a wider audience as well.
I know that it was something that was discussed at length during the last mandate, and I suppose with the introduction of the support for mother and baby home survivors, it's the taboo that's around that in particular, and the culture of secrecy and shame around that. There is probably an unknown number of people there that have been affected that we can't access, and I don't know what new or innovative ways you could come up with to access those people, or to make them aware of what support there is there. But I appreciate your
and when we talk about historical institutional abuse, there's certainly been advertising campaigns and similar. There's also been work by the Commissioner for Historical Institutional Abuse that has reached out beyond Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland, GB, and further afield as well. So there are ways to make the services more visible, and we continue to take those steps.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious about the relationship with 48 community and voluntary groups you describe as your partners. Has there ever been any competition around funding between yourselves and those groups? And then, I suppose, the broad range of groups that would be considered your partners. It must be a strained relationship at times, particularly when some of the experiences of families who have lost loved ones at the hands of the state and are still trying to get access to justice in that. So is it primarily your role to provide advice, guidance, access to the regional trauma network? And then what is the relationship with funding?
So there's no competition for funding between VSS and the community and voluntary sector. We are effectively the funder on behalf of the Executive Office. We have at regular intervals gone out to competition to invite organisations to come forward and access that funding. That's how we've got the 48 at the minute. We'll be moving in the next year or 2 years to a new round of that programme funding, and give those organisations to have an opportunity to change what they do, or to increase certain areas of their funding, and also for other organisations to come forward. or for indeed for organisations to come together and group together in different ways. So there's plenty of opportunity there. We do refer to the organisations as our community partners, because we don't really like to look at it as a very straight grantor and grantee organisation. We're there to support them in what they do, and we try to maintain that kind of relationship. And the most important thing, I think, for us is choice for victims and survivors. So as you point out, there's 48 organisations coming from a range of different communities and backgrounds, and the important thing is that victims and survivors can find an organisation close to them that they feel comfortable with in terms of access and support and services. There's also a grouping within that 48 who are now going to be partners with VSS in a new Peace Plus programme, which is currently under assessment. So we haven't been awarded that funding as yet, but we expect that to come, and that will be another step for a smaller number of organisations to be part of delivering a wider project, a €25 million project that's delivering the health and wellbeing support, the advocacy, resilience, research, and trauma education. So there's good relationships across all those organisations and in between the organisations as well. And one of the key focuses of Peace Plus moving forward within the new partnership is having lots more connections between the organisations, that if there's a service that isn't available within one, it is available in another, that there's connections there that individuals can pass between and amongst organisations to get the support that they need.
In relation to the regional trauma network, what is the oversight role?
So the Regional Trauma Network has the Partnership Board, which is made up, as I said, at the very beginning, chaired by the Executive Office and the Department of Health, and overseen then with board members from the Health and Social Care Trusts and 6 of the community and voluntary organisations, the BACP registered organisations that deliver most of the services. So that there is a body there that oversees and takes decisions for the Regional Trauma Network. It is a unique collaboration in itself of statutory and voluntary sector coming together. So that's something that we have to work through at every board meeting and take those decisions together. But that again is just bringing everyone a little bit closer together. It's bringing community and voluntary sector closer to the statutory sector and creating those opportunities to sort of co-plan the care for individuals across both sectors.
It's at an early stage in the rolling out of that particular service. It'll be interesting to see over the next 6 months to a year what way referrals are going. We're seeing at the moment they are referring people to us in the same way that we are referring through to the statutory sector. But it'll be interesting to see how the number of people, how quick, how easy or how difficult it is to make referrals through. And I don't know if there is a review, Andrew, at some stage over the next year or so.
We're really in the period of constant review because it is so new and it's getting up and running, and it's we've set the initial pathways, but it's about testing those now, and there's many people who have moved through in both directions in those pathways and continuing to evolve and improve how those two sectors work together. So there will be continual review of that. It is a pilot phase effectively for victims and survivors for at least 3 years. So there is time to get it right before we start to think about what comes next.
Did you want to comment?
It really is.
It's just that my last point is how do you ensure then that the services within health and social care trusts are trauma informed? Because my experience on behalf of a lot of constituents are not.
Within the Regional Trauma Network, the interaction with the trusts is through the regional trauma teams within the trusts, and there is one strand of the work for the network itself is around trauma-informed practice, and there's been a range of delivery of sessions and training and awareness raising for everyone as part of that. So it is definitely on our mind, and it's one of the sort of subgroup areas within RTN that will continue to make those suggestions.
It was just in the back of what Carl was asking about as well. I mean, there's such incredible pressure on the mental health services within the trusts as it currently is within every section of Northern Ireland, no matter where the trust is. There's tremendous pressure. There's not enough skills. There's not enough experience. They can't recruit staff. And I'm just wondering, to ensure that you have that high level of expertise and staff delivering those services, are you finding it difficult to have and keep staff because you're sharing, you're sharing that with the core delivery of the trust, right? So is that, are you finding it difficult?
I mean, it's primarily for the community and voluntary sector, I suppose, to recruit those staff on that side of the RTN. And yes, I know that there is labour challenges for VSS, for community and voluntary organisations. And a lot of the, I suppose RTN covers all the range of services, really. I think your question alludes primarily to the sort of clinical side, and that is definitely an issue within the statutory part of RTN. It's the same for everyone.
In fact, we have a 3-year pilot. It gives us both sides a bit of breathing space to try and get this right. But of course, there are all those pressures you talk about for within the health and social care side.
Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, but I just wanted to just give you a chance then. You've mentioned some of the areas that you'd like us to consider and take forward and follow up with the Executive Office. I'm just wondering, is there anything else in that space that we can do? Conscious that you'd said that there's going to be another round of funding. Are you confident that you're going to have enough money to be able to work with your partners in terms of your own running costs, staffing structure?
I suppose we look forward to a budget position for the coming year, for 24-25, sometime in early April. I suppose the key issues that I think they have come up and the things that we asked the committee to think about is that representation on the deadline in the Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme. That's certainly one. And I suppose the victim strategy and just continuing with the progress on that is another. Mother and baby, migrant laundries and workhouses, again, we're keen to get to the point where we're providing support and services around the work of the panel and the inquiry. So we're keen to move into that space as quickly as possible. So those are sort of the 3 things that are probably most pressing.
And trauma awareness training.
Okay, well, thank you both, Oliver and Andrew. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm sure you'll be back in front of committee at a later stage, but thank you for now.
Thank you.
Okay, members, just take our ease for a little minute. We're going to, our next presentation is from the Office of the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors and the Victims and Survivors Forum. Are we taking that as a joint?
Yes.
Yes, good job.
Stay off it. Doing too much of it.
Okay, just while we're getting set up there, members, so the clerk's brief is on page 57, and as we see, we've got a number of people presenting today. So we've got Andrew Sloan, who's the Chief Executive for the Commission for Victims and Survivors, Deborah Ho, I think that is that Howe, sorry, I knew I was going to say that wrong, Director of Policy Development, Research and Engagement at the Commission for Victims and Survivors, and Natasha Butler, Forum Member, Victims Survivors Forum, and David Crab, of course I got that wrong, Forum Member for the Victims and Survivors Forum. So you're all very welcome. If you just want to take your seats up at the front. Okay. Did I get everyone there? 1, 2. Yeah. Oh, sorry, 4. Right, so somebody's not going to take it. Okay, so I'm not sure who's going to lead and who's going to start, but
I think I'll lead to start with.
Great
and
stuff.
give you the opening statement.
Yeah.
And my colleagues will come in afterwards.
Wonderful.
If that's okay.
Thank you. Go ahead, Andrew. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I'll start with some introductions. I'm Andrew Sloan, Chief Executive at the Commission for Victims and Survivors, and here with me today is Deborah Howe, Director of Policy Development, Research and Engagement, Natasha Butler and David Crab, both volunteer members of the Victims and Survivors Forum. I won't outline the nature of Natasha and David's victimhood because I'll get them to introduce themselves at the end of what I say. I'm going to give a brief overview of some recent work completed by the Commission because I think it outlines the background and context on which we must focus our future priorities, and indeed where we feel ministers and the Executive Office can contribute to supporting the needs of victims and society across our society. This will include the replenishment process of the Victims and Survivors Forum, some recent research, advice and information papers published by the Commission and its relevance to the new victims strategy, the challenges faced by victims and survivors in the wake of the Legacy Act and in the absence of a Commissioner, although I have received and welcome the commitment from the First and Deputy First Minister in progressing the appointment of a new Commissioner. I'll start with the forum replenishment process that completed towards the end of last year. Members are likely aware that convening a forum for consultation is one of the statutory duties of our office to ensure that research areas and policy advice are mindful of the lived experiences of victims and survivors and that their views are central to that work. The replenishment of the forum has been a lasting priority for the Commission for a number of years, but due to challenges around the absence of a Commissioner, particularly in the period August 2020 to May 2022, could not be taken forward, as the statutory power for making appointment rests with the Commissioner. Prior to Ian Jeffers' tenure as Commissioner, the forum was made up of 8 active members, each of whom had been there for a long period of time. Staff and existing members all recognise the need for new viewpoints, energy, and crucially, a better balance of representation of community background and nature of harm caused. Following the appointment of Ian Jeffers, we developed a robust replenishment process that sought to achieve this aim. We welcome that we have made the successful appointment of 10 new and valued members of the forum who now join the 8 long-standing members who have agreed to serve for a further 3-year period. This brings total forum membership to 18, and thanks to the robust replenishment process, we feel we have successfully fulfilled the objective of a widely representative and highly competent group and look forward to their continued input to our work over the coming years. I would also like to put on official record my thanks and acknowledgement to every single person who engaged and applied throughout the process along the way. Drawing on some incredibly difficult life experiences is not always an easy thing to put yourself through, and we are extremely grateful to every person who gave their time and energy to the process. Members will be aware that prior to Ian Jeffers' departure as Commissioner in January this year, he led advice to Government on the needs of bereaved victims and survivors and made a recommendation on the need for a payment scheme that would acknowledge the specific experiences of bereaved individuals. We welcome that within the draft strategy for victims and survivors currently out for consultation, that Government make a commitment to deliver appropriate support for the bereaved and will point towards this advice paper's recommendations for delivering that commitment. We fully recognise there is much work through in relation to the funding and eligibility for such a scheme, not least the differing opinions on the legal definition of a victim, whether any such payment should be statutorily enacted or a service delivery provision. We would, however, hope that the advice paper serves as a starting point for opening the conversation so that resolutions to these issues can be found. The Commission last appeared in front of this committee back in 2021. At that time, we presented some of the key findings from a Northern Ireland population survey, which found that 24% of the population here could meet the legal definition of a victim and survivor. Since then, I'm pleased to say that we've worked to complete a similar survey in the Republic of Ireland and are in the final stages of completing a Great Britain-focused population survey. I believe these surveys will serve as a strong baseline for the new strategy for victims and survivors and will hopefully guide the strategy's delivery throughout its lifetime. The Republic of Ireland survey found that 10% of Ireland's population also meet the legal definition of a victim and survivor. And interim findings from the Great Britain survey suggest that 8% of people meet the same definition across England, Scotland and Wales. In terms of addressing the legacy of the past, 88% of Northern Ireland's population feel this is important, as do 82% in the Republic of Ireland and 78% in Great Britain. Over the past number of years, the Commission has been looking at ways in which learning from and about the past can help in the journey of reconciliation, and crucially, how we use that learning to prevent any reoccurrence of widespread violence. We have looked at this educational piece from both a formal and informal perspective. Deborah's team at the Commission produced a recommendation paper on building for a better future by learning the past. which we would be happy to circulate after this session. Likewise, the communications team have developed other engagement activities, including podcast episodes and arts-based projects to include schools, community and the wider public in that education piece, all of which have proved incredibly successful. The appetite for learning the past is backed up by the population survey across the 3 jurisdictions. When we asked about the importance of teaching Troubles history, 61% of Northern Ireland's population felt Troubles teaching should be compulsory at some stage within the formal education system. When asked a similar question in their respective surveys, 65% of respondents in the Republic of Ireland also felt this learning would be compulsory, as did over half the Great Britain respondents. As we enter the period of a new victims and survivors strategy, it is our hope that the issues outlined around the education and acknowledgement can be further developed through comprehensive action plans that the Commission and Forum can support the Executive in achieving this. I know many, if not all of you here in this room, were every bit as opposed to the Legacy Bill as the Commission and Forum for reasons that are all on public record. Given that the legislation is now in active Parliament, and in the interest of time, I know it may not be fruitful to reiterate our reasons for that opposition, but in looking forward, I do think the Commission, the Executive and all those who worked in the areas of legacy justice processes, civil cases and information recovery must be mindful of the varied impacts this legislative change will have on victims and survivors. Whilst the recent High Court ruling found that the Legacy Act's clause outlining the provisions for immunity from prosecution were in contravention of the European Convention on Human Rights, it remains the case that ICRA and other aspects of the Act will proceed from 1st of May this year onwards. This is, of course, an ever-moving picture whilst we wait the outcome of further legal challenges and appeals processes. But I do want to focus on a key practical matter that will impact upon victims and survivors who are either going through the processes currently or who will choose to engage with ICRA once it becomes operational. Of primary concern to us, and a matter we have raised with ICRA and PSNI's Legacy Investigations Branch, is the need for clarity in communication that it is only the legal responsibility of cases that will pass over from current mechanisms to ICRA and not the case files themselves. We feel there may be an assumption that everything will be handed over from 1st of May, which is not the case. Files will only transfer to ICRA at the request of an individual or families. We have been given assurance from PSNI's Legacy Investigation Branch that they will take action to this point, but we would have similar concerns around the clarity of legacy case files with other bodies at present, including the Police Ombudsman, inquest files, civil case files, and jurisdictional police forces across Great Britain. We would ask the committee to seek clear, sensitive and victim-centred communication from relevant bodies to victims and survivors as to the status of their case files after the 1st of May, and clearly outline any action they must take should they wish for a case to be taken forward by ICRA. The Commission is open to engaging with any of these bodies on ways that this could potentially be achieved. In summing up the future priorities, and in particular in seeking the committee's support, I will conclude with the following. In a time of so much change and uncertainty facing victims and survivors, it is crucial we have an independent public figure who can elevate their needs to government across these islands. As mentioned earlier, I have received correspondence from the First and Deputy First Minister advising that the administrative preparations to recruit a new Commissioner are underway and they hope to launch the recruitment process soon. As an accounting officer, I fully understand the need to follow due process in line with public appointments regulation. I would only ask that the committee's support in ensuring that every step of the process can be expedited as quickly as possible. Effectively resourcing the delivery of the upcoming Victims and Survivors strategy is a priority. Whilst we understand the resource pressures currently faced by government, the ageing population of so many victims and survivors means this resource must be a priority if Northern Ireland is to say with confidence that it took every measure possible to look after those impacted by its decades of violence. It is also an investment that will prevent the legacy of the violence filtering down to future generations. Despite the widespread opposition to the UK Government's Legacy Act and the nature in which ICRA was established, the reality is ICRA will become operational on the 1st of May. I would ask the committee to determine ways in which the Executive can work in collaboration with the Northern Ireland Office to make the best of what we have at the moment in time for those victims and survivors who will inevitably engage. In taking forward a new victim strategy, I would ask the Executive and Assembly to find ways forward on key areas, regardless of how contentious they might be. I'm not here to put anybody on the spot in terms of such issues, and I'm all too aware that they will never be resolved in a single committee session. But it is in the Commission's view that workable solutions can be found when the political will is there to do so. And I would ask that parties do begin a process of working this through together. The Commission are happy to engage with any members here today or party representatives to discuss any of these issues in more details. But I'd like to thank you for your time, and I bear my indulgence and let my colleagues introduce themselves. So start with.
Go ahead.
I am David Crabb. I'm a new member of the forum. My background is that I served for 30 years in the British Army during the conflict here, including in the Ulster Defence Regiment and the Royal Irish Regiment. I'm also a retired civil servant, but that doesn't make me a bad person.
You're all right now. You're all right now.
He gets the hard question.
I did suffer both injury and physical and mental during my service, and bereavement as well. I'm also involved in a number of groups which deal with veterans of those who served during the conflict, including the police, the armed forces, and the prison service. However, I'm on the forum as an individual, and I'm not in a representative capacity for that. And the reason I joined the forum is I just feel that there's not enough space for dialogue, and especially to explore and understand the competing narratives of the conflict. And I'm very keen that we use this space to do that as much as possible.
Natasha, would you like to say?
Thank you. I'm the granddaughter of an innocent victim of our conflict. My grandfather was killed in July 1972, along with the parish priest and 3 children. My reasons for, I'm a new member of the forum, my reasons for joining the Victims Forum is to give a voice to the intergeneration of our conflict, which is to raise awareness of the transgenerational trauma we suffer. Why I may not have been around when my grandfather was killed, but I bore the wounds of not addressing the legacy of the past and the continuing re-traumatisation it gives. While it may be too late for my generation, there is hope for future generations. If we address the legacy of the past, we can promote true and lasting reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you both.
I'm Deborah High. I'm the Director of Policy, Research and Engagement at the Commission.
Thank you very much, and you're all very welcome to committee. I just want to pick up maybe on that point, Deborah, you've just talked about there in terms of the research papers and stuff. I think, did you say that you said produce some research papers as a commission? Yes. Do you want to maybe talk to those a wee bit and just give us a flavour of what you were looking into?
Over the past few years, some of this was before my time. The Commission was a partner in the Peace 4 programme, and it produced 4 pieces of research under that. So one was It Didn't End in 1998, which looks at transgenerational trauma, and it's a really accessible piece of research, and it talks about the different impacts that you would see in families as a result of the Troubles. Things like, parents being really overprotective or parents being emotionally distant, and the different impacts of that. Coming out of that, we built policy onto that, which was the Learning the Past policy recommendations, which really built upon that. There was a piece of research on mental health and trauma, and it made recommendations that hopefully will be carried. We're going to do a second piece of research around mental health and trauma through Peace Plus, but we haven't heard back on the application for it. We also had recommendations around advocacy and what supports are needed for really good advocacy services. And the fourth one was like an update of the 2012 Comprehensive Needs Assessment, really looking at what were the needs of victims and survivors, and it was things, you know, sort of truth, justice, information and services. We've also done the 3 population surveys that Andrew mentioned. So there was in 2021 the Northern Ireland Population Survey, the ROI last year, and then we haven't finalised the report, but we will have one coming up in GB.
Okay, well, thank you.
Sorry, can I just say, these pieces of research and the population surveys, they all feed directly into the new victims and survivors strategy. So they support it, and essentially the population surveys are around providing a baseline within that strategy of where we are now, so that we can actually measure where we've got to whenever we get some distance down the road.
Yeah. Okay. No, my background's in research way back, so I'm always interested in that. I'm going to pick up on the fact that there's no commissioner at the minute, and obviously in Northern Ireland we've got a number of commissioners, including the probably most recent the Victims of Crime Commissioner, and so there would be people who would maybe provide that they provide support for in terms of sexual abuse or clerical abuse, for example. And I'm just wondering how those roles will cross over in terms of advocacy, and you know how you would see that their voices could be represented in the new strategy.
I think well, the new strategy is specifically around victims and survivors of the Troubles.
Yes, but some of them would almost be like in terms of like paramilitary, you know, there's just, I think there's a bit of a crossover sometimes.
There will always be a crossover,
Yeah.
and we work very closely with all the other commissioners, whether it's historical institutional abuse or the victim of crime commissioner.
Yeah.
Whenever Ian was in post, Ian Jeffers was in post, he would have met regularly with all those other commissioners and tried to develop initiatives or strategies that would meet the needs of all the victims and survivors.
Okay, thank you. And just a last one then for me for now, and that's around that you talked about the challenges from the Legacy Act and the seeking the clarification of case files. Certainly as we as a committee we will follow that up. But I'm just wondering, even just in terms of the emotional impact that you have picked up from people in terms of the passing of that act and there's an enactment.
Well, there's certainly widespread opposition to the Act, and I don't say that there was 100% opposition to the Act, because there is always some people who maybe do support it. I think it has taken away a lot of options for victims and survivors. You know, inquests were delivering results for some victims and survivors. Legal or civil cases were also providing some results for victims and survivors, but all of that stops, and it all moves into this new body on the 1st of May. And I'm not sure the public and in particular victims and survivors are aware that they actually have to initiate with ICRA the continuation of their case, or the information recovery, or whatever mechanism their ICRA is going to use to investigate a particular case. I think there's an assumption that on the 1st of May their file moves over to the ICRA office and investigation continues. That is not the case. Investigation will stop at midnight on the 30th of April, and I think PSNI Legacy Branch said to us it would be illegal for them to continue to investigate any case after that. Same for the Police Ombudsman or any other body that's looking at cases, including inquests. So they will stop. There is some that will continue, but it's a very, very small number.
Thank you, Connie.
Thanks, Paula. Thank you all for coming here today. Thanks especially David and Natasha for coming and using your experience in this way. It's really appreciated. I have 2 questions if we have time, please, Chair. And also want to say I wish we had a commissioner here as well. I think it would be really positive to have a commissioner in post, and I hope that's done as soon as possible. Our first question relates to the Commissioner's Office proposed bereavement payment scheme. It was something that we responded to as a party before we had the institutions back up and running. I think there was some really positive things in there, and I think even listening earlier to the Victims and Survivors Service, that there is actually a gendered lens that we can look through for these payments. So I think something as well that I really want to acknowledge was the including of siblings being one of the eligibility criteria. I know that's been left out of other bereavement schemes, so I thought that was really important. I really was just wanting to ask what input the Victims and Survivors Forum had into that, as well as other groups, and also sort of the thought process and how the decision was taken to have no cut-off date for the scheme, because I know that's something that seems to be quite unique to this proposal that hasn't been in place with other payment schemes.
So, and thank you for your response. There was quite a bit of engagement went on probably from about March time last year right through to December when we finalised the paper. So the Victim and Survivor Forum are our consultative group. So once we had sort of a shape that these are the issues that we think we need to look at, that went to the forum to get their views on what do you think about different things. So it's around like what type of scheme should it be? Would it be given VSS additional funding for them to administer it, or would it be a statutory scheme? Should siblings be included? So those different areas, we test them with the forum, and then we went out and contacted all of the groups for views. Had a few one-to-one meetings, and then we had a bigger event in the office where with about sort of 15 representatives came along, and it was really there and through those one-to-one meetings that went on over the summer of getting a sense from victims and survivors, particularly around siblings, because siblings aren't included in any of the other schemes. But it was really the impact of a bereavement on the family, that it wasn't just that you were losing your brother and sister, but actually you lost your parents as well for a lot of people, because life was never the same, and it was really acknowledging that. Other issues that came up through our engagement were things like rather than it being a payment per deceased person, each individual who's eligible would be entitled to a payment. And the reason for that was, it came through very clearly in the engagement, that where a family is given a certain amount of money and you have to divide it up among all of the family members, it can actually re-traumatise people, and it can cause divisions in families. So rather than it being something that's a positive, it can actually turn into a negative and break up families. There was also the issue around inequity, that if you came from a very, very big family, you would have a very different amount than if you came from a small family. There were views around that just increasing the current payment that VSS administer would be much easier, and it probably would be, but the issue with that is that would then come out of VSS's funding pot. So if their funding was reduced, it would have a very negative impact on all of the other services that they fund. Around the cut-off date, the reason we don't have a cut-off date is on the Victims and Survivors Order. It doesn't give a cut-off date. So that's the basis that when it would go to decision makers, they may well put in a date, but we don't have a date that we work to, because the Victims and Survivors Order doesn't have a cut-off date. So it's purely around our VARAs and our role that we wouldn't do that. In addition to speaking to victims and survivors, we also talk quite a bit to sort of, academics, criminal injuries compensation scheme, the victims payment scheme, to sort of what lessons would you learn from that scheme if you were doing a bereaved scheme. So since we issued the advice, I've been going out, probably what a commissioner would be doing, going out and sort of getting a sense from different groups around the key recommendations, and there is a sense of consensus around a statutory scheme, including siblings, so that's what we're just trying to build that evidence base in as this progresses.
Maybe if we could just bring in David and Natasha.
That'd be brilliant, thanks.
Yeah.
No, you go first.
I think the scheme is extremely important, especially in the likes of siblings, because we don't want to have a scheme in place where there's inequality across, as Deborah touched upon, larger families. Also, it's a meaningful acknowledgement for what happened for our troubled past. I think it's an important scheme. It's one that should be agreed upon, because it just brings us back to help moving forward as a society. Especially, there is a very meaningful acknowledgement in regard to the Victims Payment Pension Board, which is working well for people who are psychologically injured from the Troubles and physically injured. So I feel it would be important recognition to help with the bereaved side of things, because there is it was kind of estimated roughly about 13,000 people. This scheme would be kind of touching upon who would be sort of eligible. Is there anything else, David, you feel that you would need to touch upon?
I agree with all of that, and I would just say, I mean, the important factor is it's an acknowledgement payment, it's not a compensatory payment, and that's something which is often misunderstood. I think the other thing is just to emphasise what's been said about the holistic family element of it, because bereavement doesn't just touch individuals, but touches the family as an holistic group, and that's always been something that I don't think has been acknowledged in that same way. So that's been discussed through, and I think it's good to see that in the outworking of the proposals.
Okay, go ahead, Connie, with another piece.
Okay, thank you. I think the other one was just on your findings that 24% of people in Northern Ireland would meet the definition of a victim and survivor. That's obviously a really, really high amount. Do you find that a lot of those people aren't engaged formally or informally with a victims group? They are, I think, as another member alluded to earlier, it's people often are on their own, they're silent, they're not talking about their pain. How do you reach out and try and engage with those people as Commissioner's Office? And how do you, if a lot of them aren't engaged with services and bodies and groups to represent them, how do you make sure you can represent their views that are often maybe not heard?
Well, the definition's a very broad definition, but the 24% was for Northern Ireland in 2021. Most people don't need to access groups, and that can be for a range of reasons. Maybe they feel like they don't need to, or they don't want to, and they maybe use different mechanisms. So I suppose from our perspective, how we try to reach out are through all of the communication channels that we can, of making all of our work as accessible as possible. So we put it out on social media, and that was one of the things with the bereaved that was good. There were individuals coming back who would have said they weren't involved in a group, but they wanted to provide feedback. So those channels, you can get sort of two-way information, and that's in our work then with. In any of the work that we're doing where we're talking with the Legacy Act being implemented, it's around having really effective communication where you can reach those people who may not be going to a group or may not watch the news because they can't face watching the news, which is something that you would hear. So it's, I suppose, using just all of the communication channels that we can. So, I mean, one of the comms tools that was developed were animations, which were a really accessible way and just very engaging, that last a couple of minutes, and they set out what the Commission's about, understanding trauma and different issues that would be relevant, that can help you if you need to be signposted, the likes of VSS, that can help you work out where you need to go.
Okay, thank you.
I just come in just on that. I mean, it's a very prevalent issue about getting messages out there, and I'm involved in a couple of VSS supported groups. I think it's what needs to be understood is with a lot of these groups, the 48 groups that were mentioned. They have a very wide network and spread widely into the community, but very often people only come through on a trusted path, and very often that's a one-to-one basis. So it's a very slow and incremental process. And when it comes to the likes of the TPDDS, there are people who haven't engaged with that because they've gone so far and got stuck, and they're still sitting there. It's one of the reasons we think that there should be a pushback on the 31st of August date. But they have a lot of people without the help of groups, without the advocacy that they provide, don't do that, because those people will only come forward if they're approached on like a one-to-one basis, or on a somebody they know or somebody they can trust. So it's a very difficult situation, but there's no single fix to it. You can put telephone numbers in the paper and all, but people aren't going to ring them if they don't know who's on the other end of the phone.
That's a good point, thank you. Okay, so I've got Brian and then Carol, please.
Thanks for your presentations and all the earlier comments made to Oliver and Andrew you'll have heard that are relevant. So I had, in my previous role in Belfast City Council, I had quite a bit of dealings with Ian Jeffers around the time of the Bloody Friday 50th anniversary commemoration that we had at City Hall, and that family members attended. So we had engagement with Ian before and after, and I know he made the point at the time that they were seeking to increase the representation on the Victims and Survivors Forum. So I'm pleased to see that I did speak to some groups at the time. I'm pleased to see the additional people, and thank you, Natasha and David, for the role you play there. you've mentioned about the appointment of the new commissioner that we'll all want to indeed support and expedite. And it's important that the forum is there to provide that living, experience to guide the work of the Office of the Commissioner and the staff. So that's the only question I wanted to ask, a bit more about the forum, about what role you have. Is it just to advise the Commissioner, or do you have engagement yourselves with groups and other victims and survivors? And are you still looking at additional members, or do you feel it's the right sort of size now?
Well, I think to go in reverse in your questions, I think it's at the right size. Okay. At the minute, there's 18 members on that. 10 of those new members. And to use the sort of group theory, we're at the sort of forming stage at the minute, and we'll quickly move into norming and performing very, very quickly. That would be helped if there was a commissioner in post. The forum is there to provide the commissioner with that lived experience, and it's one of the mechanisms that the commissioner uses to get that lived experience. So the commissioner may go out to some of the groups and meet individuals at those groups, or other individuals out and about that either come into the commission, or we go out and seek out ourselves, or email us, or if anybody emails us, we always go back to them and elicit their views and try and make sure that we build those views into whatever we're doing.
Asha, do you want to give a...
Oh yes, well, in regards to the forum, what we do is we bring our lived experience to key shareholders and share our experience. But at the minute, without a commissioner, we currently have no public face for victims and survivors, especially going through the current difficult times with the Act in Parliament. Having a commissioner is imperative, just to help bring our stories to the public view, and also in regard to sharing the lived experiences with the Northern Ireland Executive and any key policy holders. Would you like to add to that, David?
Yeah, just to pick up on the points made about groups and things like that. I mean, a number of members of the forum are involved with outside groups. Say they don't come to the forum in a representative capacity, but they bring that sort of wealth of knowledge with it, and that's across the board. But one thing I've been very impressed with in the time I've been with the forum is the diverse range, the diversity that's in the group, and I think that's so important to have that melting pot in there to get that wide range of views. And we do have robust discussion without harming each other. It's great. But no, I mean, I think in terms of being that initial sounding board for a commissioner, I think it's very important to get things off on the right footing. When we're looking at policy development or policy advice development for that, because that diverse range is there, and it may point in different directions that we need to focus more heavily on. But at least it's there as an initial go-to. I think it's crucially important from that point of view.
Okay, thank you, Carol.
Thanks very much. Good to see you again, Andrew.
Good to see you, Carol.
For coming to the committee, it's not easy. But if, for example, there were things apart from the commissioner, that's quite clear that you need that advocate. What else that you feel that hasn't already been covered, that needs to have a better expression, particularly in any new programme for government?
I think the primary thing is to have the new victims and survivors strategy finalised, finalised and resourced. The last strategy ran from the period 2009 to 2019. We're in March 2024, and we're still doing carry forwards of the old strategy, and that really affects organisations like VSS, because they can't go out and do those sort of processes about asking the groups to apply in unless there is a new strategy there to do that, and the funding there to do it. I believe earlier you were talking about the sort of human resource implications of it. whenever you have people out in those groups who are working away and they're getting 1% pay increases for the last 5 years, it makes it really hard to keep them in a job. And and every year, just in the mouth of Christmas, they'll get the letter to say you're on 3 months' notice because we haven't got a budget.
Yeah.
And people will just simply vote with their feet and go off and find jobs elsewhere. So that would be a key priority for us to get that strategy developed and resourced. And I do have to say, the draft strategy is out there. Our feedback on it is that there's no targets in the strategy, and there's no monitoring framework within that strategy either. Carol, you will remember.
Thankfully.
Sport matters.
Yeah.
And
no targets.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's really in terms of it needs to have an outcomes-based.
Outcomes, not outputs.
Yeah, absolutely.
And cross-departmental, because victims and survivors issues are across every department, and it's how then those issues work across different departments and how there's resource allocated among different departments, that it's not just sort of lumped in with what everything else that's happening. So that's what we had suggested, like a cross-departmental action plan that would have resources and responsibilities and monitoring and reporting and review built into it.
Okay.
I just maybe mentioned, sorry, Chair, on the resourcing piece. It's the third and community sector that are doing the heavy lifting in all the service provision, and they are seeing a decline in funding because rents have gone up, electricity's gone up, everything else has gone up, and the capacity hasn't gone up in line with need and needs to go up in line with need. So when we talk about resourcing it needs to get out to those who are providing the service. Sorry, that's
All right, I need to go, but thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got Claire and then Harry.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you particularly David and Natasha. I do think that personal experience is really powerful, and I think stories are really powerful. And David, you had mentioned the need for dialogue, and I actually think that's the key to reconciliation in Northern Ireland. I think it's the key to how we heal. I suppose I'm conscious that dialogue happens more often than not in closed rooms with limited numbers of people, and I think if we're genuinely going to benefit from that, it has to be rolled out right across Northern Ireland and understand that. My father was a former member of the British Army, then subsequently the prison service, and he passed away a couple of years ago, but up and down to the cancer centre, he and I had an awful lot of conversations, and I think if people had heard his stories, there's people who would have perceptions because of those roles that would have a very different perception of what his intentions was, which my situation was very, very good. So how do we genuinely roll out that dialogue? Because, as I said, I've been in politics now 15 years, 10 years in MLA this year, and it does happen. Of course it doesn't. It happens very successfully, but it's not maybe reaching the areas that it needs to reach.
I agree with you 100%. It's not reaching the areas that it should reach, and particularly when we talk about intergenerational. We do try and reach, in organisations I'm involved with, we do try and reach into future generations, and they don't know, they don't understand, but they need to understand. And I think if we're going forward, absolutely need to understand. The opportunities just aren't there, and they need to be created, but they need to be created in safe spaces. And I think that's the trick that has to be turned. The forum is a great, safe space for everyone to talk. But moving forward, I know some of the groups I'm involved with would have great difficulty in going to certain areas and certain groups and things, and vice versa. Personally, I've done it many times and have had some great conversations and great and promoted better understanding on both sides of the equation. And that is really what. And so I'm hopeful that in the generational move forward, that those barriers can be lowered and more opportunities can be given in a more public way, that those discussions can take place in a meaningful way, because it's all about understanding. It's all about why, different perspectives and understanding those perspectives, and it's not getting there at the moment, and I can't see it there, and I can't see it moving towards that, but it needs to move towards that, especially for my grandchildren and my grandchildren's children, that's what we're looking at now. As Natasha mentioned earlier, it's maybe too late for my generation, too late for my kids, but their kids, their grandkids, and moving forward for that. So I don't know what the immediate answer is, but I'm hopeful that we can move towards that. And I suppose the more we mention it, the more we try and plug it, the more we can create it.
Can I just bring Deborah in on that?
It was around that policy work that we had done around education was sort of like really broad education, so it wasn't just the education system. There were recommendations around, using opportunities within the curriculum, empowering teachers to feel comfortable of going in and teaching the troubles or conflict, because it's something we had done work, and it was something that came back from teachers, something they were very reticent to cover because everybody feels that they bring their own narrative with it, and it can be very difficult to teach. So beyond sort of the curriculum and sort of initial teacher education and look at issues there, but also the tools, because one of the things that came up in the It Didn't End in 1998 research was around, and work that we had done with Northern Ireland Youth Forum, was that actually, even not cross-community, but even within families didn't talk about it. And I was very struck when we worked with the Youth Forum that said, things only sort of trickled out of experiences that families had, and they weren't discussed. So there wasn't even an understanding of children of what had happened in their own family beyond what had happened in from a different community. So it's, I think, even at that very basic level of providing people with the tools of how do you have conversations but that don't traumatise or that don't overburden children and young people, but to give the sort of those tools to understand what the past was like and why you don't want to go back to it.
Do you think there's political will there? Because it is very politically contentious, because everybody has their own perspective in relation to it, but sometimes I believe that it will require political leadership to really want to take it forward. Like I know we're in 2024, we talk 25 years later, we really should have moved on for all of this, but we're not going to move on until we deal with it. So, I wonder, is there more that politicians, leaders could do in terms of really encouraging that dialogue in a way that's genuine and, to be honest, not ticking boxes? Yes, we have to deal with the past, but we're not dealing with it. So
I suppose if you can see that the executive are working together and improving society in Northern Ireland at those sort of very operational things that impact on day-to-day life, then that's a real political leadership and showing everybody can work together, and that sets an example. And sort of how we treat people with respect and what language is appropriate, and not to glorify the past, but to be honest about it. But just, I think that sort of an executive that's function contributes to it.
I think it's getting there, but it's getting there very, very slowly.
Okay, thank you. So, Harry, please.
Thank you, Chair. Deborah, you mentioned building for a better future. I'm just wondering, basically, who you're conversing with about this.
Oh, that was a piece of work that I started in about August 2022. So it was actually a very long process of engagement. It built on, before I started, the Commission had produced a submission for the Independent Review of Education, and it set where the Commission stands on a number of key issues. So it was really building onto that. When Ian Jeffers came in, one of his priorities was around history and education. So it was sort of taking his perspective on what was there. So it built, the way that it went, it was building on what was already there, but going out and speaking to. We had a pilot project with the Northern Ireland Youth Forum. So we had a youth panel who I went out and talked through what the recommendations were and got their feedback. The forum are always involved and getting their views on, are there gaps? Is there something that would provide us with really useful feedback around, language and what should be covered? And then also speaking to a range of stakeholders, the likes of Ulster Museum, academics, quite a few academics, people who are involved in teacher education. And so really building there, but on the framework of what we had already said and those key things around, that children and young people should be able to understand the legacy of the past, and that there is a legacy. It's not just the past, it has a legacy that's very alive in a lot of people's lives. Building on It Didn't End in 1998 research, the importance of mainstreaming victims and survivors issues across government, because the impact on housing, health, education, they do have an impact, because when you have 24% of the population say they could be a victim or survivor, when you watch the news, when you see all of the different things that are happening at the minute, it really shapes Northern Ireland. So about equipping families and communities to be able to talk about the past and to put those tools in place, and then sort of education, and also around the links between it's always very vocal about the links between poverty and educational underachievement, but you also add in, when you look at those areas where the lowest levels of achievement are, they're in the areas that were worst affected in the Troubles. So there are those links of, sort of where communities moved from after 1998, and where is the benefit, and how you build in, because if you have if people are able to attain their best and do their best, all of that contributes to a more positive future.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Emma,
Chair.
did you want to come in?
I'm okay, thank you.
So we've got quite a number of actions there and things that we as a committee are going to take forward. So really appreciate your time today. So
We always come with a list.
No,
almost.
that's what we're here for. That's what we're here for. But look, I really appreciate all of your contributions today. Really, I thought it was a really good session, and it's certainly food for thought, but certainly action for us to take forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, members. So are we agreed then? We'll converse with the clerk and his team then, just to catalogue the actual actions from that, and we'll move forward on that basis across the two sessions, of course. Okay, members. So in terms of the agenda, we'll move on to item 7 there. So we've got the draft forward work programme, which is at page 60. Are we content to proceed on the basis there? And obviously we've got the strategy day, so we'll be able to really populate it after that event. And then under correspondence, so correspondence starts at page 69, and we've got also then got some tabled papers as well, so there's a summary of the committee correspondence there. So I would refer you to page 195 of the pack, and that's a request from the Northern Ireland Youth Assembly to attend the committee and discuss matters informally with members, and I suppose it sort of picks up on the last couple of segments there. So the request is really around engagement, and so there are a couple of ways we could look at this. We could look at it sort of them to come in a wee bit like the BRA pupils earlier, or we could meet with them informally. So I'm just wondering, are you content for me to work with the clerk then, and we'll come up with
Whatever
a way
works.
of engagement?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just discuss with them whatever they would prefer.
Yes, exactly. Okay, and then in terms of page 212 of your pack, there's a request from the Law Centre NI to brief the committee on issues relating to migration. So obviously there's a focus, TU have got a remit around refugees and those people seeking asylum and stuff. So I suppose what we'll try and do is create a committee meeting around that sort of migration piece and the racial equality strategy, for example. So we'll come back to you on that. Okay, so members, any other business? Are there any matters anyone would like to raise? No? Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. That's the end of the meeting. Obviously, we've got recess for 2 weeks, so our next meeting's on Wednesday, the 10th of April at 2 p.m. in this room. Thank you.
Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound.